Renik Doss had been a county tax collector for 19 years. Before the morning, he refused to count the Orcs on Adric Vey's land, and he had been 13 years old when he had decided he wanted to be a tax collector. And the path between the boy who had wanted the work and the man who was going to lose it had been so direct and so unremarkable that on the day the supervisor took the brass-numbered token off his coat in the courthouse foyer, Renik Doss could not, when he tried to remember it, find any part of his life that had not been pointed at the work and had not been ended by walking away from it. He was 47 that autumn. He lived in a small rented room above the dry goods store on the south side of Ferris Hollow, the county seat. And he had lived there for 19 years, and the room had a narrow bed and a wooden chair and a small writing desk and a chest in which he kept the 4 pairs of dark wool trousers and the 4 cream linen shirts he wore in rotation through the working week, and a single folded suit of better wool he wore to the funerals of the county's older landowners, and the dark gray wool coat with the brass-numbered token pinned to the left lapel that identified him on the road and at the gates of the farms he visited as a county tax collector with the authority to count what was on the property and to assess what was owed. He carried a leather satchel with a small brass clasp, and inside it he carried a leather-bound ledger and 3 sharpened pencils and a small folding rule, and a folded measuring chain, and a small set of brass weights for the assessment of grain. He walked his circuit on foot. He had a horse the county provided when he asked for one, but he preferred to walk because walking gave him the time between farms that he needed to do the small arithmetic in his head that was the actual work, and because walking had been how his father had done the work before him, and because walking was the one thing he had ever been certain he was good at. The Orcs on Adric Vey's land had been there for 2 years. They had come in the autumn of the year before last, and Renik Doss had counted them on his autumn circuit that first year, 4 of them, 2 adults and 2 children. And he had entered them in the ledger under the column the county used for what they called dependent labor, which was the column the county used for orcs and for indentured servants, and for the very small number of free hired hands who lived on the property they worked. And the entry had been the same kind of entry he had made for the 82 other persons of dependent labor on the 82 other farms of his circuit. And he had handed Adric Vey the assessment slip, and Adric Vey had paid the assessed tax. And Renik Doss had walked on to the next farm, and he had not thought about the 4 Orcs again for a year. The next year there were 9. He had walked up the dirt road to Adric Vey's gate on the last Tuesday of the harvest moon in the 2nd autumn of his counting, and he had stopped at the gate to do the small piece of arithmetic he always did at the gate of a farm before he opened it, which was to look at the buildings and the fields and the smoke from the chimneys, and to make a small first estimate in his head of what the farm should owe, and then to compare that first estimate to the actual count when he had finished the count, because his father had taught him at 13 that the difference between the first estimate and the actual count was the only honest measure of a tax collector's work. The first estimate at Adric Vey's gate that morning had been higher than it had been the year before. There were 2 new chimneys. There were 3 new shed roofs visible from the road. There was a long stack of squared timber along the south fence. There was a small fenced kitchen garden beside the cabin that had not been there the year before, and the kitchen garden was 4 times the size of what one farmer and his wife would have planted. And Renik Doss had stood at the gate for a long count and had understood, before he had even opened the latch, that the farm had grown in a way that would require him to count more dependent labor than he had counted the year before, and that the count would translate into a tax assessment that would be substantially higher, and that the substantially higher assessment would be entered into the county ledger that the county clerk submitted to the regional revenue office on the last day of the harvest moon, and that the regional revenue office would, as it always did, flag the increase, and that the flag would generate, as it always did, a follow-up visit from a man who did not work for the county, but who worked for the regional revenue office, and who did not collect taxes, but who collected what the regional revenue office quietly called surplus-dependent persons. Renik Doss had stood at Adric Vey's gate for a long count that morning, his hand on the latch, and he had thought about the small follow-up visit that would come if he counted the new Orcs honestly. And he had thought about the man who would conduct the follow-up visit, and he had thought about what surplus-dependent persons meant when it left a county tax ledger and entered a regional account book and turned, by the slow arithmetic of bureaucracy, into a number on a manifest at a slave market 3 counties to the south. And then Renik Doss had opened the gate and had walked up the path. Adric Vey was at the woodpile splitting kindling. He was a thin, gray-haired man of perhaps 60, with a deeply weathered face and quiet brown eyes, and the kind of patient, slow movements of a man who had farmed alone for many years before he had decided not to be alone anymore. And he had set down the splitting axe when he saw Renik Doss coming up the path, and he had wiped his hands on the front of his coat, and he had said, "Mr. Doss." Renik Doss had touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Vey." "Tea, please." They had sat at the kitchen table with 2 tin cups of weak black tea, and Adric Vey had not pretended that the count he was about to receive was the same count as the year before. He had laid his hands flat on the table, and he had said, in the clean, direct way of a man who had decided the night before what he was going to say, "There are 9 of them now, 5 more than last year. The aunt of the first family came in the spring with her 2 children. The old grandfather came in the summer alone. He had been walking 3 months. I do not know all of their names yet. They work the land. I pay them in lodging and food, and 1 share in 3 of the harvest. They are not chattel. They are not indentured. They are guests on this farm, and they will leave when they choose to leave, or stay when they choose to stay. I will pay you what is fair for the increase in the working land. I will not pay you the dependent labor assessment, because they are not dependent, and they are not labor in the meaning of the word your county uses." Renik Doss had drunk his tea. He had not touched the satchel on the floor beside his chair. He had thought about the brass-numbered token on the lapel of his coat. He had thought about the small writing desk in the rented room above the dry goods store. He had thought about the 4 pairs of dark wool trousers in the chest. He had thought about his father, who had walked the same circuit for 31 years and had retired with a small pension, and had died on the road 2 miles outside of Ferris Hollow, on his first autumn, walking the road that was no longer his work, and who had, in his final years, made a habit of saying to Renik that the work of a tax collector was the work of a person who had decided every morning what he was going to count and what he was going to refuse to count, and that this decision was the beginning and end of the moral life of the work, and that anyone who told you the work was just arithmetic had never done the work. Renik Doss had set the tin cup down. He had said, "Mr. Vey, the increase in the working land is 16 acres of new field on the south slope, by my estimate from the gate. Is that correct?" 17 acres, Adric Vey had said. "Closer to 17. We finished clearing the last patch in the third week of summer. 17 acres at the working land rate is 1 silver and 4 coppers per acre. That is 1 gold crown, 2 silver, and 8 coppers." "I have it ready," Adric Vey had said. He had stood up. He had gone to the small wooden chest beside the stove. He had counted out the assessment in coin and laid it on the table. Renik Doss had counted it, twice, the way his father had taught him. He had taken out the ledger. He had opened it to the page for Adric Vey's holding. He had entered, in the working land column, 17 acres at 1 silver 4 coppers, total 1 gold, 2 silver, 8 coppers, paid this date. He had not entered anything in the dependent labor column. He had closed the ledger. He had stood up. He had taken his hat from the peg by the door. He had said, "Mr. Vey, whatever I write in the column for dependent labor goes into the regional ledger, and from there it goes elsewhere. The elsewhere is not a place I can describe to you here. I will not write what is true in the column. I will not write what is false in the column either. I will leave the column blank. I will tell my supervisor that I did not see anyone on this property other than yourself, and that you have not yet hired any field hands for the season. I will sign the page in the regular way. The page will go to the regional office, and it will be filed. There may be a follow-up question from the regional office. There usually is not. If there is, I will answer it the way I answer all such questions." Adric Vey had looked at him for a long count. He had said, "Mr. Doss, why are you doing this?" Renik Doss had thought about it. He had said, "Because the column is the part of the work I have decided to refuse, and I have decided this morning, between the gate and this kitchen, after 34 years of doing the work as it has been written. I would have decided sooner if I had been braver." He had touched the brim of his hat. He had walked out of the cabin. He had finished the day's circuit. He had walked back to Ferris Hollow at dusk. The supervisor, a heavy-set man named Lorvik Ash, who had been a tax collector for 28 years and was now the collector of collectors, had called Renik Doss into the small back office of the courthouse the next morning at 8. He had had Renik Doss's submitted ledger open on the desk in front of him. He had been holding a folded letter from the regional revenue office in his other hand. He had not asked Renik Doss to sit. "The Vey holding has 9 dependents on it," Lorvik Ash had said. "The regional office has a flag from a check visit 2 weeks ago by an outside assessor. They knew before you walked up the road. They wanted to see what you would write. You wrote nothing. You also told me yesterday afternoon there was no one on the property. That was a lie." "Yes," Renik Doss had said. "Why?" "Because the column is the part of the work I have decided to refuse." Lorvik Ash had looked at him for a long count. He had laid the letter down on the desk. He had said, in a voice that had gone smaller and more tired than it had been when he had begun, "Renik, I have known your father. I knew him for 19 years. I have known you for 19. I will not put any of this in writing if you will resign now. You can take the morning. You can go upstairs to your room. You can come back in an hour with a clean letter, and we will have it signed by noon, and the office will write back to the regional office that the count was an oversight by a long-serving officer who has retired, and the matter will go no further on your end. The Vey holding will be visited by a different officer next week, and the count will be done correctly, and the regional office will get what it wants. You cannot stop that part. You can only choose whether you are still in this office while it happens. Renik Doss had thought about it for what felt like a long time. He had said, "I am not going to resign." Lorvik Ash had closed his eyes. "Renik, I am going to make you take the token off my coat. I am going to make you put it in writing. I am going to make the regional office understand that a tax collector refused. The Vey holding will be visited. I cannot stop that, but I can make sure the next collector in the next county who is sitting at someone's kitchen table with a tin cup of tea in his hand and looking at a column he has decided to refuse knows that the refusal is a thing that can be done, and that the man who did it before him survived it. That is what I can do. It is the last piece of the work." Lorvik Ash had stood up slowly. He had walked around the desk. He had taken the brass-numbered token off the lapel of Renik Doss's gray wool coat with his own hand, and he had laid it on the desk, and he had said, in the small, quiet voice he had used at his own son's funeral the spring before, "Walk out of the building. Don't stop in the foyer. Don't speak to anyone. I will write the letter. The letter will be the kind of letter that does what you want it to do. I will see to that. Now go." Renik Doss had walked out of the building. He had not stopped in the foyer. The clerk at the front desk, a woman named Pelta, who had brought Renik a cup of tea every morning for 19 years, had looked up at him as he passed, and had not said anything, but had touched her hand to her chest in a small private gesture, and Renik Doss had touched the brim of his hat to her without breaking stride. He had walked up the wooden stairs to the rented room above the dry goods store. He had laid the gray wool coat on the bed. He had taken the 4 pairs of dark wool trousers and the 4 cream linen shirts and the folded suit of better wool out of the chest and laid them on the bed beside the coat. He had stood in the middle of the small room for a long count and had understood that he had no idea what to do next, and that having no idea what to do next was, after 34 years of having an idea what to do next every single morning, the most unfamiliar thing that had ever happened to him. He had sat in the wooden chair at the writing desk. He had written on a blank sheet of paper the words, "I am Renik Doss. I am 47. I have been a tax collector. I am now not." He had folded the paper. He had put it in his coat pocket. He had not known why. He had walked out of the room and down the stairs and out of the dry goods store and across the small main street of Ferris Hollow, and he had walked with no destination in mind, north out of the town, along the road that led eventually, in 3 days' walking, to Adric Vey's farm. He had not been planning to walk to Adric Vey's farm. The road had simply been the road his feet had known. He had walked for 2 hours before he had realized where his feet were taking him, and he had stopped at the small bridge over the dry creek where the road bent away from the river country, and had stood there for a long count, and had thought about turning back, and he had not turned back, and he had walked on. He had reached Adric Vey's farm at the end of the 2nd day. He had slept the first night in a small farm shed by the road that he had counted the inventory of for 16 straight years, and that he knew the owner of, and the owner, a small, thin man named Henrik Bream, who had owed back taxes twice in the 16 years, and had been forgiven twice by Renik Doss in his quiet way, had given him supper and a wool blanket, and had asked no questions. The second night, he had slept in a clearing near a stream he had known since boyhood. On the morning of the third day, he had walked up the dirt road to Adric Vey's gate. He had not been wearing the gray wool coat. He had left it on the bed in the rented room. He had been wearing the better wool suit, because it was the only other coat he owned, and the lean month was coming, and the morning had been cold. He had stopped at the gate. He had looked at the farm. The gate had been mended since the last visit. There were 2 new chimneys, 3 shed roofs, the squared timber along the south fence, the kitchen garden 4 times the size of 2 people's needs, the 17 new acres of cleared ground on the south slope, and at the kitchen window of the cabin, looking out at the road, was the face of an Orc woman of perhaps 35 with a faded green tribal tattoo running along her right cheekbone, and she had seen him at the gate, and she had turned her head and called something into the room behind her, and Adric Vey had come out of the cabin door with his sleeves rolled to the forearms, and he had walked across the yard to the gate, and he had stopped at the gate on the inside, and he had said, "Mr. Doss, Mr. Vey, without the coat, without the coat." Adric Vey had looked at him for a long count. He had said, "You lost the work?" "I did. Because of us. Because of the column." Adric Vey had nodded slowly. He had said, "There is a small cabin at the western edge of the property that the cousins built last spring, and that is empty because the cousins moved into the bunkhouse for the winter. It has a stove and a bed and a small wood store. It is yours, if you would like it. There is no obligation. I will not pay you anything. I will not ask you for anything. The cabin is yours because it is empty, and because you are tired, and because we have, all of us, in this house, decided in the past 23 minutes since my wife saw you on the road that we would like to give it to you." Renik Doss had stood at the gate. He had thought about the kitchen window and the Orc woman's face, and he had thought about the small private gesture of Pelta the clerk, and he had thought about Lorvik Ash's small, tired voice at the desk, and he had thought about his father on the road 2 miles outside of Ferris Hollow, and he had said, yes. He had moved into the small cabin at the western edge of the property the next afternoon. He had brought, in a single canvas pack, the 4 pairs of dark wool trousers, and the 4 cream linen shirts, and the folded suit of better wool, and the leather-bound ledger, and the 3 sharpened pencils, and the small folding rule, and the folded measuring chain, and the small set of brass weights for the assessment of grain. And he had brought also the brass-numbered token which Lorvik Ash had quietly slipped into Renik Doss's coat pocket on the way out of the office, in a final gesture of the friendship of 19 years, and Renik Doss had not taken the token out of the pocket and had not yet decided what to do with it. The first weeks were strange. He had not in 19 years slept anywhere except the rented room above the dry goods store. He had not in 34 years woken in the morning without an immediate task in front of him. He sat on the porch step of the small cabin in the lean month's cold mornings, and he watched the Orcs and the humans of Adric Vey's land go about the small, ordinary work of a homestead in winter, and he did not know what to do with himself. Adric Vey's wife, whose name was Caris, and who had married him 5 years before, the second wife, the first having died in childbirth 20 years earlier on a farm 3 counties south, brought Renik Doss bread and tea and porridge for the first 3 mornings without speaking. And on the 4th morning she sat on the porch step beside him and she said in her quiet, practical voice, "What did you do with your days when you were the taxman?" "I walked," Renik Doss had said. "I counted, I added, I subtracted, I wrote the figures in a book." "Can you read?" "Yes." "Can you teach a 35-year-old orc woman who has just learned the human alphabet how to read full sentences?" Renik Doss had thought about it. "I have never taught anyone anything," he had said. "But I know the alphabet very well, and I have read most of the books in the county library, and I have been adding and subtracting in my head for the entirety of my adult life, and if she is patient, I will be patient back. Her name is Vesha. She is the woman you saw at the kitchen window. She is the aunt who came with the 2 children in the spring. She has decided she would like to read. I will teach her." Renik Doss had said he had taught her. He had begun the next morning at the kitchen table of the main cabin. Vesha, who had a face cut deep with the long lines of an orc woman who had walked too many miles in her life, and a quiet, patient voice, and dark, steady eyes, and a faded green tribal tattoo on her right cheekbone in a delicate angular pattern, sat across the table from him with the small, worn primer the village school used for the youngest children, and Renik Doss, who had been a tax collector for 34 years, and had not until that moment understood that the entire structure of his work had been a particular kind of refusal of the people he had counted, taught Vesha to read full sentences. By the first frost she was reading. By the deep snow she was reading aloud from the small, worn book of road tales he had brought from the county library at her request, and by the first thaw she was teaching the 2 children. And by the second spring, there were 4 orcs and 2 human children of the next farm over coming up the road 3 afternoons a week to the kitchen of the small cabin at the western edge of Adric Vey's property to learn the human alphabet from the man in the better wool suit who had once been a tax collector and was now a teacher. He found in those first months that teaching was a slower kind of arithmetic than the arithmetic of the column had been, and a more honest kind, because the answers were not on a manifest in another county, but on the face of the person sitting across from him at the kitchen table when she finally read the sentence she had been struggling with the day before. And the face of a person reading her first sentence was an answer that did not need to be checked twice, and did not need to be entered in a ledger, and did not need to be passed up to a regional office. And Renik Doss, who had been good at his old work in the way a man is good at a thing he has done every morning for 19 years, found that he was good at this work too, and in a different way. A way that did not ask him to refuse the column, because the column did not exist. He sat at the kitchen table across from Vesha through the long evenings of the first winter, and he watched her dark eyes move along the lines of small, worn pages, the way a person watches the slow, careful first crossing of a river. And on the night she finished the small book of road tales and closed it and laid her green hand flat on the cover and looked up at him without speaking, he understood, slowly, the way he understood everything, that he had spent the whole of his old life being good at the wrong thing, and that the wrong thing had been an honest mistake. But a mistake all the same, and that the lean month evenings of the small cabin at the western edge of Adric Vey's property were the first time in his 47 years that he had been good at the right thing. He kept teaching. The 2 human children of the neighboring farm, a boy of 9 and a girl of 11, whose father, a quiet widower named Bryn Holloway, had walked them up the road on a Tuesday morning of the second autumn and had said, "I hear you teach, I cannot pay," became Renik Doss's first students who were not Orc. And after Bryn Holloway and his children, 3 more farms in the small valley sent their children too. And by the second spring, the kitchen of the small cabin had 4 to 7 children at the table on any given afternoon, and the small folding rule and the leather-bound ledger and the 3 sharpened pencils that had once been the tools of the column became the tools of the teaching, and the small set of brass weights for the assessment of grain became, in a small lesson, he taught them on a Tuesday in the 3rd spring. The way he showed the children that a thing that was meant to weigh grain could also be used to weigh anything that needed to be weighed, and that what mattered was not the weight itself, but the choice of what you put on the scale and what you decided counted as fair. Vesha sat at the table during many of the lessons in the first year, and after that she sat at the back of the room and listened. And after that she began to teach the youngest children herself, in her quiet, patient voice, with the small, careful pause she had learned to put before each new word. He had taught for 6 years. The school had grown. By the 3rd year, Adric Vey had given him the use of the bunkhouse, which had been built large for the cousins, and had emptied as they had moved into proper cabins. And Renik Doss had set up a small school at the long bench inside, and the orc and human children of 3 farms had walked up the road in all weather, and Renik Doss had taught them with the small folding rule, and the leather-bound ledger, and the 3 sharpened pencils, and the small set of brass weights for the assessment of grain, how to read, and how to add, and how to subtract, and how to weigh a thing fairly. He had taken the brass numbered token out of his coat pocket in the 2nd year and had hung it from a piece of twine on the wall above the long bench. And on the day he hung it, he had told the children, there had been 7 of them at the time, 4 orc and 3 human, that the token had been given to him by a man who had loved him, and that the meaning of it had been that he had been a person whose job was to count things, and that he was now a person whose job was to teach them what he had learned was worth counting and what he had learned was not, and that the children should look at the token sometimes and remember that it was possible to refuse the column, and that refusing the column was a thing that could be done by an ordinary man on an ordinary morning at a kitchen table with a tin cup of tea in his hand. He had died many winters later in the small cabin at the western edge of Adric Vey's property, with Vesha's hand on his, and Adric Vey standing in the doorway, and the 2 children of Vesha, who were now grown and who had children of their own, sitting on the porch step where he had sat in the first lean month of his time on the property, when he had not yet known what to do with his days. And the brass-numbered token was still hanging from its piece of twine on the wall of the bunkhouse-school, and on the morning after his burial, Vesha walked into the bunkhouse-school and took the token down from its twine and tucked it into the pocket of her own coat, and she carried it for the rest of her own long life. And she taught the children of 3 farms how to read for 31 more years, and on the wall above the long bench she hung instead a small wooden plaque that she had carved herself with a knife, and on which she had burned the words, "This is the column we have decided to refuse." He had been a tax collector for 19 years. He had refused to count 9 orcs on a farmer's land. He had lost his job the next day. He had walked north to the gate where the column had been, and the man at the gate had said, "Come in." That was the beginning. That was everything. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much, Greenbound.